Good morning, everyone. It's my great pleasure to be here moderating this technical session, Build Back Better, Let's Make Women Count, that the World Bank and the WRI Ross Center for Sustainable Cities are hosting as part of Transforming Transportation this year. I'm Franz Drees-Gross. I'm the Regional Director for Infrastructure in Latin America at the World Bank. I think all of us attending Transforming Transportation this year sense that public transport is really at an inflection point. During the COVID pandemic, we've seen dramatic reductions in ridership in public transport systems across the world. I think at its nadir in April or May of last year, many public transport systems across Latin America and the world were basically down 70, 80, or 90% in terms of ridership. At the same time, while public transport ridership has been down so much, we've seen in many cities a push to open additional bike lanes and to turn crisis into an opportunity to increase non-motorized transport. We will, of course, emerge from this pandemic, but given the latest news from South Africa, from the UK, virus strains in Brazil, etc., I think it's very clear that this pandemic could well stretch across much of 2021, in fact, well into 2022 in many parts of the world. And as we emerge from this pandemic, we need to make the most of the opportunity to bring women and men not only back into sustainable transport at pre-crisis levels, but to actually increase ridership or the use of sustainable options going forward. The good news is that many governments across the world are prioritizing green infrastructure or climate new deals as part of their recovery plans. What isn't clear is how gender inequality will be considered as those crisis recovery platforms are rolled out. We all know what we need is a gender-responsive, sustainable investment in transport. And the reasons are very clear. Transport accounts for 16% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So increasing women's use of environmentally sustainable transport mode is as much a global environmental as it is a global social imperative. But all of us also know that it's quite clear women and men experience transport very differently. We saw it in the opening video. Very differently in terms of accessibility, affordability, and safety. And not recognizing that and not addressing that simply leads women to not look for jobs further away from home, or for girls not to take advantage of schooling opportunities. It's really a silent loss of human capital and personal opportunities, and all of us are poorer for the loss of those opportunities. ILO estimates that in developing countries, limited access to and poor safety of transport is the single biggest barrier to increased labor force participation by women. Of course, there's another dimension to the transport problem. It's women's employment in the transport sector. Women as drivers, women as engineers, women as leaders in transport. Unfortunately, participation rates remain very low. And of course, that shapes the way decisions about transport are made for everybody. Without more female voices at the table, at the transport table, we're not going to increase awareness of different gender-specific needs and much less appropriate policy responses. The good news is there's no shortage of very qualified women voices at today's transport table. And I'd like to say that we're very honored that we have an esteemed panel that's going to discuss the needs for investing in green and inclusive transport infrastructure services with a focus specifically on addressing gendered mobility barriers that girls and women face. Before I introduce our esteemed panel, however, and engage them in a discussion, I'd like to give the floor to our distinguished keynote speaker, Ms. Anita Bhatia, who's Assistant Secretary General for Resource Management, Sustainability, and Partnerships, but also Deputy Executive Director for UN Women. Anita will set the context for the audience and for our panelists. Anita, with that, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Franz, and great to see you again. And thank you so much for inviting UN Women to be part of this important conversation. I'm going to start off by saying something blindingly obvious, which is that transport is actually a key to accelerating action towards gender equality and the completion of the SDGs. And that's because women's and girls' access to sustainable infrastructure, including transport, can actually help create a level playing field for many areas where women and girls face discrimination, ranging from everything, including education, to entering the job market, staying in the job market, being able to take on certain types of work over others. All of these issues that have to do with women's economic empowerment and have to do with the ability of women to actually play their rightful role in society are impacted by transport. And I want to focus particularly on the fact that safe and inclusive public transport, because it changes how women and girls have or have not freedom of movement, is one of those underappreciated levers for transformative change. Because safe and inclusive public transport can increase the ability of girls to actually participate, go to school, go to work, participate in public life, facilitate access to essential services, including essential health services, and increase opportunities for girls and women to enjoy cultural and recreational activities, improve health and well-being. It has multidimensional impacts on women's lives. We also know that more women using safe, sustainable transport will also accelerate action towards climate change. So let us not forget the indelible and important link between sustainable, safe transport and the existential issue of our time. We have seen through the pandemic that the existing barriers that women face in reducing gender inequality have actually been exacerbated. We have seen through the pandemic that women have been impacted in 3 areas, and these 3 areas are all actually connected to the issue of transport. So the 3 main impacts that we have seen on women during the pandemic have to do with income, health, and security. Income, because many of the jobs that have been lost by women are in sectors that are heavily feminized, such as retail, transport, tourism, domestic work. Health, because 70% of frontline health workers are women, so they have actually felt the burden of the care burden hugely. We know worldwide that more than 70% of nurses are women. And finally, security. We have seen a huge, I would say, an exponential rise in violence against women. You might ask, what has transport to do with this? A lot. First, because for women to actually go to work, they need safe transport. And we know from many experiences worldwide that public transport simply isn't safe enough for women. I remember as a young woman growing up in India, how much I hesitated to take public transport because I knew that that experience would never be free from some form of harassment. And we have good data on this. We have data from across the world. I'm sorry to say there isn't any region of the world which is free of this curse of harassment of women in public transport. And we have data from most countries in the world showing that this is an issue. We know that as a result of this, women are likely to make decisions about where they want to work and what kinds of work that they will take on because of unsafe transport. This means that investing in safe transport actually has multiplier effects on women's lives because it increases their job opportunities and it increases their ability to choose what kinds of work they may want to do. The broader issue of gender and infrastructure is also terribly important because we have found that actually women spend more time traveling to work than men in certain countries, again, because of the nature of their work. And we know that actually women spend a huge proportion of their time traveling back and forth. So we do need to take a gender lens, not just to the issue of transport, but to the issue of infrastructure more broadly. Now, this panel is entitled Building Back Better. And there has been a huge amount of discussion among policymakers about how to ensure that both the stimulus packages had a gender lens and how to ensure that as we build back better, we are actually building back equal. Unfortunately, our review of most stimulus packages shows that most countries have actually not been able to take a gender lens to the stimulus packages. While there have been some unconditional cash transfers, and some efforts made to ensure that monies were actually going in certain cases to women-owned businesses, by and large, the stimulus packages have been gender blind. And so it is actually quite urgent for all of you who are discussing creative ways to build back better that we actually insert a gender lens into all discussions having to do with building back better to make sure that they are building back equal. What does this specifically mean for the case of transport? First of all, we need women at the table. It is actually quite shocking through the pandemic that most decision makers around the pandemic have been men. If you just turn on the television, you hardly see women talking about the pandemic. So we need women at the table because their voices will bring in a perspective that is often forgotten. Second, there needs to be very specific targeting of women's issues in any kind of package that has to do with building back resilient systems and economies. And that also means that for transport, any thinking about budgets, any thinking about recovery plans, any thinking about new investments has to have a gender lens. Finally, I think it's really important to incorporate a gender mainstreaming approach throughout mobility policies and the entire transport infrastructure life cycle. Now, we don't have time to go into details, but I do want to mention that there is some work that UN Women have done with UN Ops to really try to think through what are the key questions that must be answered in order to ensure that any transport, any infrastructure program actually is mainstreaming gender into the thinking from inception. And this specific guidance that was developed first for Asia and Pacific is something that we are very happy to share. And we would encourage you to use that as well as other guidance from other institutions to ensure that thinking about transport is not just about building back better, but it's about building back equal. Thank you, Franz, and back to you.
Thank you very much, Anita, for that, I think, very good overview of the different ways the pandemic has impacted women, and of course, how that ties into transport, the different impacts on women's income, women's health, and women's security in that. So to discuss these issues about women and building back better, we've assembled a very nice and distinguished panel of experts who I'd like to introduce before we go to the discussion. We have with us today, we have Heather Allen, a gender and sustainable transport expert with 25 years of international experience in different fields, including gender, transport, sustainable development, and climate change. We also have with us today Sonal Shah, founder of Urban Catalysts from India, an organization working towards sustainable, equitable transportation and cities. Sonal's experience cuts across sustainable transportation, gender equality, social inclusion, station accessibility planning, neighborhood and street design, and public spaces. And finally, we have Sinem Dedetaş, the general manager of City Lines Istanbul, which is a municipal sea transport company in Istanbul. She's a shipbuilding and marine technology engineer with long experience in the maritime sector, the maritime industry in Turkey. And if you're curious about the details, you'll find all of their bios, of course, in the session information package that you can access from the reception area for TT. So without further ado, let me open the discussion starting with Heather. Heather, you're a researcher. You'll probably agree that a lack of adequate attention to women's mobility needs is in part due to the lack of sex disaggregated data, and that perhaps this is felt more acutely now as COVID-19 has differentially and disproportionately impacted women, as we heard from Anita at the outset. So I know you've done some recent research. Tell us about that research that you did on COVID-19 and women's mobility. And I understand that was in 4 countries in sub-Saharan Africa.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Franz, and hello, everyone. Thank you for joining this session. It's a really great pleasure and honor to be asked to share some of the work that I've done recently. And what we found was interesting because it talks very much to what Anita's just talked about. It touches on many of these points. So this was a study that was done in 4 sub-Saharan African countries, in Uganda, Kenya, Nigeria, and South Africa. And we looked specifically at the impact of the constraints that have been imposed through COVID on the mobility of women with low incomes. And we did this through a number of different interviews and collecting data. So really what we found, and this actually has been echoed in some of the developed world as well, particularly in the Netherlands, that of course the loss of livelihood has been really widespread and very, very deep. So women's jobs were more likely to have been lost, so that's really key. And even if they were furloughed, it was very difficult to get any money at all, any salary. So jobs such as primary teachers, or obviously, very obviously women, and predominantly women, I mean to say, not obviously women. Hairdressers, beauticians, all those kinds of things, they were all very much cut. And of course, women in the developing world have a lot of informal activities. They are informal market sellers, street sellers. They provide the food, particularly around all the transport hubs. So they had a double whammy, because the markets were very often closed, and the footfall obviously was no longer there. So not only did they not have the opportunity to sell, but they didn't have the clients either. So they found that obviously there's an increase in caring duties, but yet women had to still put the food on the table. So this connection between loss of livelihood, no income, and still putting food on the table, connected, were double connected, if you like, to the transport issue, that there was less public transport around. It was more expensive. In some places where there is no formal public transport, there was no cap, there was no possibility to cap the fares, and they went up by 100, sometimes 200%. Somewhere like Nigeria felt this very strongly with the price of oil suddenly plummeting, and their kind of naira being pegged against the US dollar. It meant that the informal public transport operators could basically ask what they liked, because of the lack of lower capacity in all the minibuses. So this was it still is a really difficult time for women. And we found that women had, because they were so busy, they didn't have access to some of the information. They missed out on a lot of the free food donations, because they weren't able to find out about it. They didn't have time to look at the websites. They didn't have, the data went to their children trying to learn rather than themselves. All these both direct transport impacts and indirect transport impacts led us to a really, I think, interesting report, which I'll put in the chat and you can download it, because there are very specific direct transport impacts on this. And the question you asked, Franz, was about data, and I've done some other work on that, called Counting Women So Women Count. But if we are going to build back better, we already knew prior to this that the data was not good, and it's going to be almost impossible to build back better in a green and just fashion if we don't do something about the transport data that we have for these already transport disadvantaged groups. And women is one of them, and there are obviously others in there. There's people with disabilities, there are children and the elderly. And just one particular point, which is different to what Anita found, we actually found in our study that sexual harassment around transport had got better, if you like. Maybe it had stayed at the same, but women were less worried about it, because they were more worried about crime, and they were more worried actually about the health security. This now shifted up the ladder of risks, if you like, and that sexual harassment, partly through social distancing and the lower capacity, has actually improved slightly. Domestic violence really is a problem, 700% in Nigeria, and that is directly linked to financial independence of women and financial stress within a couple or with men. So there's it's really a moment to think beyond just the direct transport impacts of this. But as Anita said, transport is the great facilitator for getting us to achieve the SDGs, amongst other things, and empowerment, of course.
Thanks for that, Heather, and very interesting to hear that perspective. Anita talked about sort of the impact of women's employment, but one dimension of that I hadn't thought about, which of course is women as food sellers around major transport hubs and having seen their livelihoods undermined, and the different ways that women's feeling of security around transport shifts in a pandemic like this. Let's go now to Sonal. Sonal, you're the founder of Urban Catalyst. And it's an organization, of course, that advocates for equitable transportation in cities in India. And you've been at the forefront, really, of discussions of COVID-19 and its impact on women's mobility. The pandemic, of course, is having a disproportionate impact on women. And COVID measures are requiring even more unpaid work from women, putting them at increased risk of violence and reducing their opportunities to go out and look for paid work. Unfortunately, labor force participation by women was pretty low in India even before the pandemic. And unfortunately, there's a likelihood that will actually come down right now. So let me hear, so much for the bad news, but what's the role that the transport sector can play and must play to be to advance the gender empowerment agenda in India as we rebuild from COVID?
Thank you so much, Franz, and it's nice to be here. What I'm going to do right now is share some preliminary findings that we have from a study that was funded by UK Aid, specifically looking at the impact of COVID-19. And I'm going to use that to speak about one particular group of workers, which are workers in the informal economy. These are women workers, and 92% of all women workers are actually part of the informal economy in India. And therefore, within the overall context of what Anita mentioned on the disproportionate impact of the pandemic on their livelihoods, we aim to understand how it affected their mobility. And I'm going to draw out about 4 or 5 major findings to kind of highlight what is the role that transport can play. First, we looked at primarily bus and paratransit users, and we found that women's mobility reduced, and even earlier, where work trips constituted 90% of all travel, currently 99% of their travel was for work. So women had severely restricted their work, and they were only traveling in order to earn money. The second biggest thing that we found is that even while 80% of our sample across the city of Delhi used buses, 20% of the trips were by paratransit, right? So we did surveys with about 800 resource-poor women in informal settlements in urban villages in the city of Delhi. However, close to 60% of their peak hour trips were being catered to by paratransit. Now, this is really interesting in a city where bus travel is free for women. We found that they had 2 peak hours at 11 o'clock and at 2 p.m. And I'm bringing these specifics because these specifics will begin to matter when we think about a green recovery and gender equitable green recoveries. So 60% of the trips were by paratransit, and our initial estimates based on surveys with paratransit operators found that in the city of Delhi, again, 200,000 registered paratransit operators lost close to $239 million over a 6-month period due to the pandemic-induced lockdown and reduced incomes after. Now, how did it affect women? One, they increased their fares by 20 to 30%. And when we asked women what their priorities are, the health risks due to COVID-19 unfortunately did not figure in their top three priorities. Their top three priorities remain those that existed before the pandemic as well, which were poor frequency of buses, crowded buses, street vendors unable to take their goods on the buses, and interestingly, that post the free bus travel scheme, they found that buses were not stopping for them when they saw women passengers, right? Like Heather mentioned, safety did not come up as a safety from, like I said, from the pandemic and sexual harassment. While we know it is an issue, did not emerge as such an issue currently in the current scenario. So as we think about better public transport, these are some issues that we definitely need to address. And I'm going to take just 2 more minutes to highlight 2 more aspects. There's been so much emphasis on the digitalization of public transport, thinking about digital ticketing, contactless payments. And again, our data showed us the following. Only 10% of our resource-poor women had access either to a personal smartphone or a shared smartphone. Only 2% of them knew how to make digital payments. 66% knew how to make or receive phone calls, and 17% knew how to make or receive SMSs. Does it mean that these efforts don't make sense? Of course not. But as we begin to think about these, we need to recognize the unequal access that resource-poor women, who are the most affected by the pandemic, how do they become a part of technological improvements in public transport? And the last one is, we partnered with the Self-Employed Women's Association, which is a trade union in the city of Delhi, and we know about them. They began piloting paratransit vehicles, and we found that the female paratransit operators were earning 30% less than the male paratransit operators because of what we call the safety, household, and the care tax. I think as we again begin to think about efforts in transport, we need to recognize and quantify these taxes in order to create gender responsive green recovery packages. Thank you.
Well, let me just press you on some of the distinctions you drew, because you pointed out that even though in Delhi, the public transport buses are free to women at this time, and the paratransit isn't free, even so, 60% of the trips by women in peak hours were being made on the buses that they had to pay for. And you made a couple of points about what were some of the things that seem to be driving women away. And I wonder, are those applied only to the publicly operated buses? Are those the fact that the street vendors couldn't take their goods on board? They could take them on board on the paratransit, but not on the public buses. The buses didn't stop for them. Is it the public buses that aren't stopping because they're bigger and they have their routes and they're more bureaucratic and less user-friendly? Just break out a little bit. What are the takeaways for public policy and public transport operators here? What do they need to do? They've got the advantage that they're free, and still they don't seem to be attractive to their customers, or half their customers.
Yeah. So yes, I'll highlight a few of them. One is we found that 30% of public transport routes in Delhi were reduced due to the pandemic. So that could be one. Two, the buses that don't stop for women are likely to be private buses, because public transport, bus-based public transport, has a state transport undertaking, and we also have private operators who operate on a gross cost contract, and it's a cluster-based model. So at this point, we think it is the private operators who are perhaps not stopping for the women. The issue with street vendors not being allowed on buses, I think, might be across both the STU and the privately operated buses. And this came up again and again for us, and therefore they have to rely on paratransit in order to make an earning. In terms of the policy responses, I think we have a few, and we will be releasing our paper and our recommendations within the next couple of months. We have already engaged, we've engaged with the Delhi government in order to think about increasing women's adoption of electric paratransit, so that we have more subsidies and incentives for them to take advantage of electric vehicles as we think about a green recovery. But my point being that wait for a couple of months and we'll have very, very concrete recommendations for us to share as well.
Thank you, Sonal. So let me turn now to Sinem, who joins us from Istanbul. I know you're general manager of City Lines in Istanbul, the municipal ferry company. And I know that Istanbul is making a big push to decarbonize municipal transport. So as the ferry operator, you're presumably part of that push to decarbonize. We also have discussed that women take public transport with greater frequency than men and are often therefore champions in fighting climate change. Can you talk a little bit about what that means for you very specifically? You're really on the ground, you're actually operating a service. What does it take to, in practice, what does it mean to incorporate women's needs as you make transport greener and more sustainable in Istanbul?
Hi, Franz, and hi, everybody. Thank you for inviting for me. As you mentioned, it is an undeniable fact that women form the majority in urban mobility. And we may state several reasons for it. While some of them are positive, like climate concern, however, some of them are negative, like poverty. I think our main problem here is the following. Do women think that they find their urban mobility experience satisfactory? I'm afraid the answer is hardly yes. The first and foremost most problem is, of course, the security, as Anita already discussed, and also Sonal and Heather. Besides classical methods like having safety audits and developing safety regulation, we also try to make women feel themselves secure in public transport by, for example, nowadays we are trying to provide free Wi-Fi in the ferries and allowing them to reach social media whenever they need. But the feeling of security cannot be reduced to safety precautions. It has a psychological aspect as well. Currently, our ferries and piers, as already you know, which are another pillar of the sea transportation, are really safe places in this sense, with the presence of camera equipment and personnel in them. We are also working on some elements that support the feeling of security when making any vehicle designs. Our goal is to ensure that the sea route is more preferred in public transport, so it means creating less carbon emissions. Another remarkable aspect of the women's public mobility is that mostly it is for relatively short distance. Women use public transport not only for going to work, but also for shopping and childcare. That means they are getting a ferry with their hands full of shopping bags or with a stroller. To improve the quality of the urban mobility experiences of women, we always pay a special attention on the accessibility issues. Our main aim here is to make public transport an integral part of the women's daily life. In fact, in Istanbul, a concrete step has been taken in this regard. Our mayor, Mr. İmamoğlu's decision, mothers with children under the age of 4 now use public transport free of charge in Istanbul. In addition, for the first time, we have built a children's playground on ferry so that the children can connect and love sea transportation and mothers can be comfortable during the journey. I believe that improving the quality of public transportation with a special focus on women mobility help women to participate in urban life rather than staying at home. Thank you.
Sinem, those are some very impressive measures. I'm very impressed with the children's playground on ferries. That must be quite unusual and really quite an achievement. Do you have the sense that it's working? You see women's ridership on the ferries, but also public transport increasing in Istanbul? As now that women with children under 4 can ride for free, do you see has that, was that a recent decision, or can you already see some increase in ridership because of that measure? Or what are the other things that women are now bringing to the fore that still keep them away from public transport? Yeah. Do you want to comment on that, Sinem? Do you see that it's working, or women are still, despite the free ridership for mothers with small children, is that enough, or is it? Are there other things still missing that are keeping women away?
Oh, of course, we were making a new progress, achievement on that, but we are progressing on it.
Very, very inspiring examples. Let me go back to Heather with the example. We've been talking about women and men. It's this dichotomy, just a two-way division. But of course, neither of those two universes are very homogeneous groups. And of course, women and men as groups experience transport differently. But within each group, there's huge differences by income, by age, by disabilities, ethnicity, religion, race, location. I mean, so many things play into the way within women or within men people experience transport. So if you reflect on some of that research that you talked about earlier in 4 countries in Africa, can you talk a little bit about the importance of generating these more nuanced, sort of taking lessons away from these more nuanced dimensions of gender equitable transport?
Yes, definitely. I mean, I think this is really what needs to change. This is really the mindset that needs to change. That first of all, not all women are in the vulnerable group. Not all men are not in the vulnerable group. But we tend to put women, elderly, children into vulnerable groups. They need protection rather than empowerment. And actually, transport and this COVID pandemic and the work in Africa really showed that connection between empowerment and transport is really strong. It's strong in the way that, as Sonal found, we found very similar kind of reactions in the African context of informal traders not being able to trade because they could no longer afford to take their shopping on and their goods on the transport itself. Women no longer could actually go to the market because they had to pay for children. So here, that link with formal transport actually is a beneficial link, but it also works out that not all the routes and the fare structures and the scheduling actually fit in with this whole group, because we tend to put this group into one bucket. And actually, we need to understand that we need to pull it apart a little bit. And particularly in the work I did for the FEAR Foundation on counting women, it's a very interesting report I found, because actually we asked the profession to give us their thinking on whether the current state of data collection provided the best evidence on which to develop inclusive transport policy and implementation. So that was a very nuanced question. The majority of our respondents came back were women, or they were men that were very kind of enlightened, if you like. So it then turned out to be one of the first times, I think, that the women in the profession had been asked their thoughts on the quality of data that is being used as the evidence base for this particular group. And more than 60% said that it was inadequate. More than 40% said that it was not providing value for money. And 80%, so this is men and women combined, said that the way we do it at the moment is no longer okay. And basically business as usual from now on is not an acceptable future. We need to really change the data. And an interesting response to the question, is it too difficult to do? Is it going to be too expensive to do? Overwhelmingly, it came back, no, this is not an expense thing any longer. There are technologies out there, the cost of an origin destination kind of survey, travel surveys, it's nothing like it used to be. And you can get a a level of granularity in the data that's collected now, which can really help with this really thorny issue of just kind of making people, pushing them into pigeonholes, and trying to make sure that the transport fits this lowest common denominator when actually it doesn't, and it's not serving, I don't think, anyone's purpose. And to be able to build back better, data, I think, is really one of the absolute key fundamental things that we need to improve on. Women are not proxies for men traveling in the off-peak hours, which is very much the kind of planning we have at the moment. They make different trips and they use it, you know, in off-peak, but there's nothing really different. And if we improve transport, well, everybody wins, doesn't it? It's no longer the case. So I think that the work that Sonal has done, the work that we did in Africa, also for the same funder, the HVT UK Aid Fund, it's been very interesting, and I think it's delivered some quite interesting recommendations.
Let me just press you a little bit on some of those recommendations, because if I just think perhaps in the last decade, one thing that's improved is an awareness of disability access around at least modern public transport. So, you know, I know that a lot of times now when you build a BRT or a subway station, you look very carefully at, for example, the gap between the subway train pulling up to the platform or the BRT pulling up to the platform, making sure it's even so that a wheelchair can be rolled across very easily from the platform into the vehicle, that the gap is small, that there's no unevenness between the vehicle and the platform. You know, making sure that there aren't tight corners, that wheelchairs can't get around. So there's been more of this thinking of, you know, how does a disabled person experience a subway station or a public transport, a BRT, bus rapid transit station. Now, in your work, when you've dug a little bit, are there some things that are coming out, things that are sort of immediately actionable? Do you see anything that sort of people are saying, you know, if only this thing were improved? You know, we often talk about lighting and experience, a sense of safety that comes with having not just the stations well lit, but the access to the stations. But anything, I'm just curious. I mean, maybe it's premature to expect that, but any thoughts?
Well, I mean, at the end of the day, we actually know pretty much what we have to do. Huh? You know, metros need escalators and lifts. Otherwise, you know, if you're in a wheelchair and you haven't got a lift, it doesn't matter whether there's a gap to get onto the metro station, the tube or whatever, the actual metro vehicle, because you can't even get down to the station level. Huh? And there are a number of metros that are still being built without those kinds of facilities. So, you know, that is, we know what we have to do very often. You know, there's really recommendations out there, but it's somehow shifting the mindset to make sure that this is something that you cannot build transport without, instead of a nice to have. And that, I think, is what COVID may do. We've seen COVID decimate public transport anyway, which has made public transport rethink itself, formal public transport and informal public transport as well, rethink itself. And I think that also has a shift in the concept of planning. The central business district is no longer the center of interest for everyone's trips. You don't need to commute to work quite as often as before. So people are beginning to travel a little bit more like women travel anyway. They make more frequent, shorter trips to go out and do very short errands and whatever. And so this actually has changed everybody's transport. And we need to somehow make sure that we don't just go back to what we were doing before. Because actually we know pretty much what we have to do, but we're just not doing it. I don't have a secret sauce to make sure that everyone does it, but I think the fact that we're bringing this topic more visible, we've got a great panel of, you know, women are more present in the transport sector now, and we're getting the voice heard a little bit. And I have seen progress in the last 10 years, so that's good.
I think you left us with one, actually, very, among many good things that you said, but one important soundbite is we know what to do, but we don't always do it. And perhaps one reason that even though these things are generally known somewhere, that these things are all good practices, we don't always act on them in individual cases. And maybe one reason is that the people who make decisions about those transport investments don't always look at it with that holistic perspective of the different needs of the people using it, right? And so a perfect time to go back to Sinem on this one. I mean, we know that employing more women in the transport sector isn't just a good way of increasing women's incomes, which itself, of course, is a great step, but it also leads to more inclusive transport development. The decisions that come from diverse groups of decision makers are just better decisions. They're more likely to think of all these different aspects that an able-bodied man without particular mobility needs, like myself, wouldn't necessarily think about when they get in. So in the last couple of years, we know that women have made some inroads in participating in the transport sector, but in many places they're still excluded from the real decision-making role. So you might have the women engineers and the operators, etc., but they're not always the ones actually making the ultimate decision. And so, you're a practitioner in the sector. Tell us about your experience. What do you think that, what are some of the challenges that keep women out of the transport sector in Istanbul? And what do you think the way forward is? So I'm sure you have some interesting insights on that.
Okay. Well, it is another undeniable fact that female employment rates in our sector is perhaps among the worst. And it is so in many senses for a plenty of reasons. Let me state some of them. The first and the most important reason is, of course, gender discrimination. Sometimes people think that it is women's choice to stay away from the public transportation sector. It's quite the contrary. They are kept away from this sector. Blaming women for the current status is to put the car before the horses. Women are the victim here rather than being a perpetrator. Let me request you to think about whether you would like to enter into a sector in which your career will be harshly challenged, especially when you were at the beginning of career. The very fact that the question, what are the challenges women face to enter and stay in the sector? We can ask, should make many men in our sector to be ashamed of their attitudes. In fact, this question should be addressed to men in our sector and can be briefly summarized as, what the hell are you doing here? Let us leave all the let us leave all the urban legends and prejudices aside. We believe that women can participate in our sector at various levels. In our sector, women are usually employed at the lowest level in ticket sale or customer services. These are the positions which are difficult to get, as there is a big demand for them and easy to lose. They offer no career opportunity. However, women can rarely find a better position than this. That is the reason why we started vocational education and certificate programs to train women to become shipmaster or seafarers at various ranks, so that they could develop their career through work experience based on their skills. Our aim is to create a meritocratic sector in which one is evaluated not by their gender, but by the achievements. We started with recruiting 5 women as a co-site worker, and means a person who let a rope overboard, maybe you know, which will be a shipmaster near future, and we are encouraging them not to give up. Do you know, previously this number was 0 in Şehir Istanbul City Lines, because no woman, not because no woman is applied, but because no woman is accepted. We changed this and allowed these women to develop their career and be promoted to higher positions. Last but not least, we have a strict policy of equal pay to equal work, which I believe is the touchstone of the gender segregation. Many women are employed at lower paying and informal position, but we are very determined to change it on our behalf. Thank you again.
Those are very interesting examples. I love the vocational training opportunities that Istanbul Ferries is creating. And that sort of takes me to the last question to all of you, and it's the same one, which is there's an opportunity here because, of course, as we emerge from COVID, at least some governments have announced that they're going to do sort of a Build Back Better agenda, meaning perhaps a public infrastructure push, especially a greening of public infrastructure. And the question is, how can you use an opportunity like that? There's a lot of money that will be spent, at least in some places, to advance this agenda. Just one example comes to mind. I know the World Bank, and I know we're not the only one, but other IFIs have experimented, for example, with contracts, where we basically say, look, if you're a civil works contractor and you want to bid on a road project, etc., you must create at least X positions or vocational training that will bring, train 100 women to operate bulldozers or some construction machinery or something like that. So something just to break that barrier that women don't drive a bulldozer, or women don't drive a construction company. So if you make it sort of a cost that's incumbent upon all bidders, then it's then everybody has to sort of factor that into the price of their bid. So that's something you can do when there's a lot of construction going on. You can try to change that. But you're closer to it. What are your views? If there's sort of one thing that you could do to try to advance the agenda of sort of more gender-sensitive and gender-informed transport, or women's employment in transport, well, in this context of an infrastructure push, what would you do? I don't know. Anybody want to go first? What would you? There's just one thing that you could do.
Okay.
Anybody?
Okay, let me first.
Yeah, please go ahead, Sinem.
Yeah, during the pandemic, the number of our passengers dropped drastically, nearly more than half. Since the reduction was homogeneous, we could not be able to solve this problem by cancellations. Therefore, we are in a position to serve in our normal schedule with less number of passengers. This was neither efficient nor environmental friendly, as you know. So we decided to develop a more feasible solution, and now we are working on a water taxi. These water taxis can accommodate up to 10 passengers, and they are more flexible, environmental friendly, and efficient also. We can easily adapt them to meet certain needs. For instance, a family can hire a water taxi and travel in safer environments, or we may serve to high-risk groups, such as medical persons, and take them to the nearest points to their homes, etc., reducing the risks by number of passengers while reducing the energy consumption and increasing the flexibility seems to be the best solution we developed so far.
Taxis in place of just standard large ferry services that are more individualized, people find them safer to use. Okay, so I can see that.
Yes.
More ideas, anything that if you had just one idea that you could put on a decision maker's radar screen. Sonal, do you have any suggestions?
Yeah, I think I just have a broader suggestion, which is that framing equitable access to green recoveries within the overall framework of an economic recovery. So while we're looking at the costs of what a green recovery is, it would be helpful to understand what the loss would be due to the lack of access. And I think that those can be movers, with some of the data that we have presented as well. So, and I'm just going to come back, if you don't mind, Franz, to one or two things that you mentioned earlier about moving research or moving action. You gave examples of public transport projects using universal access and using criteria and contracts, etc., as one way. One of the big things that we found is providing hand-holding support to public transport authorities is perhaps the biggest need of the hour, and that we need to recognize that this cannot be served by one gender consultant, but there will be technical specifications related to gender, there will be human resource policies, there will be behavior change. And we need to kind of acknowledge that this differentiated expertise is required to actually handhold public transport authorities, urban local bodies, in order to create gender responsive infrastructure. So, and just one other piece is, and which we haven't spoken about, is recognizing the role of women's unions and collectives in being able to advocate, negotiate, build capacity, increase awareness within resource poor women's groups. They are already doing that in multiple sectors like housing, water, sanitation, etc. How can they become a bridge when we are talking about transport services and talking about demands as well? I think these would be the two other big pieces that I would also highlight.
Sonal, are there any last thoughts? I think we have about a minute, and then we'll go to our closing.
Yes, no, I mean, I have to say that all the points made, and I think this hand holding is a really important thing, because just to have a gender consultant for a short period of time is not enough, and we need to somehow get that in-depth understanding. And I'm going to come back to data collection, because I think that this is really the most important thing, that data needs to be collected around transport, not just on the typical kind of parameters, but on sex desegregated data, trip purpose, day, and mode choice, and access to centers of interest that other people would be interested in. And I mean that people like those country level reporting to the sustainable goals. You know, one just little snippet on the work that I did in Africa, or with Gail Jennings we did jointly, was that we found that with the higher cost of transport, it was less likely that the girls would go back to school, because there were more caring duties at home again. They'd missed school, they'd maybe become pregnant with unplanned pregnancies, they'd maybe been promised in marriage. That whole girl generation actually has now been put into question, and the transport links with that and their empowerment is something we don't have in our data sets. So we cannot build back in an equitable and inclusive way, because we just don't know about it. So it's really building on that knowledge, understanding, and analysis through a different lens.
It's very insightful. Thanks, Heather. Thanks to all of our panelists, I think, for a very engaging, thought-provoking discussion today. Let me turn to Nato from the World Bank, Nato Kurshitashvili, who's a gender specialist in the World Bank's Transport Global Practice, and she's going to give us some concluding remarks. Over to you, Nato.
Thank you, Franz. Can you hear me? Perfect. So on behalf of the session organizers, I will a few concluding remarks. Our keynote speaker and all the panelists explained very well the gravity of the situation and urgency of what needs to be done in order to address gender inequalities in the sector. It is very clear that mobility barriers currently stand as one of the major factors influencing lives of the billions of women and girls to get around in the world, and reducing their life quality and life chances. I think it will be right to say that perhaps there has never been a greater urgency to act than it is now, in light of COVID-19 and the efforts that all of us are making to rethink transport and mobility in order to build back better. I would say that one of the major takeaways from this session is the fact that benefits of inclusive transportation really goes beyond individual women and girls, as it has been thought very incorrectly traditionally, right? Women's mobility is environmentally sustainable, and it has to be prioritized as part of the green transport agenda. And failure to do so will affect our efforts to build back better, and will also slow down our efforts to towards gender equality and to achieve SDGs, as Ms. Bhatia mentioned. Now, on a more positive note, we would like to share politicians, at least some of them, some policymakers, transport planners, and service providers are waking up to the magnitude of challenges confronting women and girls in simply getting around. We also have a hope that some stakeholders are understanding better and better the wider benefits that is not only for the sake of sustainable and green transport, but for the economic growth. I think Sonal mentioned a good point earlier, and also for social inclusion. So we would like to conclude with the hope that today's session contributed to moving the needle a little bit forward in enhancing our understanding of the importance and urgency of tackling this issue and tackling it now. And we would like to thank our distinguished keynote speaker and all amazing panelists for being with us, the audience to join. And we hope that you found this session informative and interesting. Thank you so much.
Thanks,
Thank you so
Nato,
much.
for that wrap up, and thanks
Thank
to
you.
everyone for joining. I saw at its peak we had something like 136 participants all over the world in this session, and I think this theme of transport and gender has become a fixture of transforming transportation. We've had it now on the transforming transportation agenda for several iterations, and I think it's important because it's building a movement, it's building commitment to this agenda, and I think just if everybody stays committed to it, it'll become the kind of no-brainer that many things that we thought were sort of on the sides 10, 20 years ago and have become fully mainstream. So that's where we need to get. This needs to be sort of a fully mainstream, understood, normal part of any transport sector planning and investment. So thanks to all of you for being part of that. And let's bring this session to a close, and I hope you enjoy the rest of Transforming Transportation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.